Hey guys. Today, we're going to continue with Spain Unveiled, and I wanted to discuss my trip to Cordoba. The Mosquita in Cordoba is definitely one of the most famous structures in Spain. And honestly, there are a lot of weird things about the whole story. I wanted to point out some of the stuff that stood out when I visited. What's most interesting about Cordoba is the hybrid architecture. Walking around the old city feels like stepping into a maze with the tight alleys that just twist around and suddenly open up into these beautiful little courtyards. Most of this area is called the Judería de Córdoba, or the Jewish Quarter. You see these Jewish quarters a lot across Spain, which is strange considering how close this one is to the Mosquita, literally right next to it. Cordoba, Spain was once the capital of Roman Baetica, and later became the Umayyad capital of Al-Andalus. It's a very beautiful place because there are multiple layers of civilization here. Interestingly, Cordoba also has a deep association with alchemy and hidden knowledge. There's even an alchemy museum here. Now, the Mosquita, it's hard to grasp how massive and detailed it really is just from the outside. It's the city's most famous monument. And at first it feels kind of understated, but then you start noticing the Moorish design still visible on the outer walls. One detail that stood out to me was a repeating ancient swastika pattern above one of the exterior doors. It's strange because this motif shows up in so many different cultures. So is it Moorish? Or did they inherit and reincorporate an even older design? Keep walking past the mosque and you hit what they call the Roman Bridge. According to the official story, it's been there since the 1st century, but it's also supposedly been rebuilt several times, and what's standing now is mostly from the 8th century built by Arabs. So is it Roman, Arab, both? Hard to say because the timeline gets kind of blurry here. Then you got two other strange structures nearby, the Triumph of San Rafael and the Puerta de Puente or Bridge Gate. The Triumph is supposedly from the 18th century, but to me it almost looks like it was reusing parts of something way older. There's even a Visigothic pillar right in it. Again, like so much in Spain, you get the feeling that these pieces were already there and just got rearranged or renamed. Then there's the door to the bridge, which is said to have been built in the 16th century to commemorate a visit from King Philip II. Seems a bit much just for a king's visit. And oh, it just so happens to be in the exact same location as a former Roman gate. Right before you enter the Mosquita, there's this one area that looks really out of place. It's got Roman style elements at the bottom, Gothic style above that, and then you've got the Moorish horseshoe arch on top. The wooden door here is extremely intricate and detailed. There are a few different areas like this. Okay, but once you finally get in, this is where you get to walk through what's basically a forest of columns. It's pretty insane in person. There are over 850 columns still standing, and originally there were closer to 1200. They're arranged in rows that just seem to stretch forever, and then they have the classic red and white double arches above them. What's really interesting is that they tell us a lot of these pillars were reused from older Roman and Visigothic structures. The bases, shafts, and capitals don't all match, and they're made of different materials too. Jasper, marble, and granite. But really think about that. So they just took pillars from another temple and patched it all together? This practice is called spolia, and while you do see it in other mosques, there's something off about the official story here, especially since this pattern shows up in other so-called reused sites. It's not just that the materials were repurposed, it's that the layout is so precise, so perfectly aligned and symmetrical. Are we really supposed to believe this was built out of scrap? And beyond that, why would the new Arab conquerors choose to use the very architecture of the civilization they supposedly replaced? And the iconic arches with the alternating red and white stripes made from stone and brick, we're told they're both decorative and structural. You'd think this was a uniquely Moorish feature, but apparently it wasn't. According to historians, they actually borrowed it from the Visigoths. You can see nearly the exact same horseshoe arch style in Visigothic churches in Spain, like the Church of San Juan Bautista. Even more curious, the double horseshoe arch shows up in places like the Aqueduct of Segovia. That structure alone raises a ton of questions, but it makes you wonder, are we really just seeing a chain of reused architectural knowledge? Or is there something else going on here? And this is just the start. What's so bizarre about the Mosquita, or in English it's called the Mosque Cathedral, what makes it so unique is that after the Reconquista, the Catholics decided to literally build a cathedral right over the mosque and seamlessly blend it all together. It's absolutely insane to go from the mosque portion to the cathedral, and just the way the lighting transitions, the sudden emergence of a Gothic dome. It's beyond belief. But wait, hold up. So we're supposed to believe that the Christians, who were fighting to reconquer the land from the Moors, decided to keep their architecture. Not just that, but they built an entire church within a mosque? Not only does the mainstream historical narrative make zero sense, it defies logic, especially from an architectural standpoint. How in the world did they construct this in the middle of an almost 1,000-year mosque in the 16th century? They tell us that the original mosque had wooden planks for the ceiling. Yet it's not just a cathedral in the center, they actually built Gothic ceilings on top of the arches. Think about that. The original mosque, constructed in the 8th century, featured a flat wooden roof supported by a forest of columns. Then centuries later, they insert a massive Renaissance cathedral nave right into the heart of it, complete with soaring vaults and a central dome. The Gothic dome and vaulting aren't lightweight. We're supposed to believe they layered heavy Gothic stonework on top of an 8th century column grid that was never designed to support it. And let's not forget, they tell us that the original mosque ceiling was just wood planks, not vaulted or arched. So how did they retrofit a massive stone cathedral without foundational reinforcement? But again, why would the Catholics, who had just won a religious war, go to such incredible lengths to preserve a mosque, only to surgically insert a church into it? The whole story contradicts itself, and yet we're expected to just accept it without question. There are no doubt layers of different styles. You have the Roman Visigothic layer, the Moorish layer, the Mudahar layer, and then the Gothic Baroque layer. However, how much of this was truly separated, and is there another reason that the builders of the structure decided to seamlessly blend it all together? Let's just be honest, it seems very unlikely that this cathedral was built with the technology supposedly possessed in the 16th century. Think about the logistics. While many other cathedrals in Spain are just as questionable, the fact that this was built directly in the center of the mosque makes this whole process even more challenging. No modern scaffolding, no cranes, and extremely limited engineering knowledge compared to today. They would have had to carefully remove support beams, cut through the roof, and somehow dig deep footings for the cathedral's load-bearing elements, all while keeping the surrounding mosque from crumbling. There's a lot more to cover when it comes to the mosque, but one thing I definitely have to bring up is the mihrab, the prayer niche, and the Kufic writing around it. Now, one thing that's really strange about this is the mihrab doesn't point towards Mecca. It's actually aligned almost due south, which is totally off from the expected southeast direction that a mihrab should face from Spain. This isn't just a minor mistake. Orientation towards Mecca is one of the core features of a mosque design. So what are we looking at here? Could it be that this structure wasn't originally built as a mosque? That maybe it had a different function, or was repurposed later and retrofitted with Islamic elements? And yet, they kept it. Even after the Christians came in and built a full cathedral inside the mosque, they didn't remove the mihrab. It's still there, fully preserved, with its elaborate gold mosaics and intricate Kufic script wrapping around the arch. And it's not just decorative, it includes actual verses from the Quran. Some could argue that the inscriptions might have been added later, maybe during a restoration or as a way to honor the site's layered history. But even if that was the case, it still raises the same question. Why would a Catholic church leave a core Islamic religious feature like this completely intact, right in the heart of a supposed Christianized space? Interestingly, there are layers beneath the mosque that are said to belong to the original Basilica of St. Vincent Martyr. You got mosaics buried nearly 3 meters below the current floor level of the mosque. Some say the original church was razed, others claim it was simply repurposed. How much of it remained intact, no one really knows. The scale of the original church tends to get downplayed, and maybe that's intentional, because you start seeing the same pattern in other places too. What's even more curious is that scholars still debate whether the mosaics are Visigothic or Roman, which makes it hard to pin down what exactly was there to begin with. But the strangest part is the full 3-meter depth. How does that happen in a city with continuous habitation? Some researchers have even suggested a cataclysmic event or a mud flood may have buried the original ground level before the mosque was ever built. Also, there is a bell tower here that was supposedly constructed in the 16th century, and again, there was already an existing Moorish minaret here, so they just built over it? Here's what we're told. The original minaret, built by Abd al-Rahman III in the 10th century, stood about 47 meters tall with a square base and was a major architectural achievement of its time. After the Christian conquest in 1236, the Mosquita remained mostly unchanged under the Castilian Christians until 1523. But it wasn't until the late 16th century, after a storm or earthquake in 1589 damaged the tower, making it unstable, that the major changes were made. Instead of demolishing the damaged minaret, they decided to encase it within a new Renaissance-style bell tower, designed by Hernán Ruiz III. This new tower, completed in the early 17th century, enveloped the original minaret, effectively hiding it from view but preserving it within. So wait, that timeline doesn't really add up. Cordoba was officially taken by Christian forces in 1236 during the Reconquista under Ferdinand III. But instead of demolishing the mosque and rebuilding right away, like they did in other cities, they left it standing and only made gradual changes. And it wasn't until 300 years later, between 1523 and 1600 under Charles V, that they finally inserted the main Christian cathedral nave right into the center of the mosque. Okay, but this whole story is extremely convoluted. According to the traditional account, the site of the Mosquita was originally a Visigothic church, so the Muslims supposedly built their mosque over a Christian structure. Then centuries later, the Christians took it back, and instead of tearing it down, they preserved the Islamic structure and built over that. So we're expected to believe that both sides just kept building on top of each other's religious sites without fully erasing them? Some accounts say the original church was destroyed and replaced entirely, and that Christians were only allowed to build a small church outside the city walls. But others, like the 10th century historian Al-Razi, claim that the mosque was a direct conversion of the existing church. So even the official story is full of contradictions. This is a painting of what it looked like in 1863, which looks drastically different to me. You can see some Roman pillars at the front that no longer seem to be there. Another interesting thing about what's beneath the Mosquita is that there are legends of underground tunnels connecting major structures in Cordoba. For some reason, this is dismissed by the mainstream as just fantasy, but the stories are oddly specific, and it makes you wonder if there's a reason they don't want people looking into it. The thing is, if these tunnels do exist, then the authorities would definitely know about them. And that would mean they are purposely keeping them hidden. I've seen this kind of thing before in Pensacola, but in Cordoba, it actually seems to be common knowledge that there's a vast network of underground tunnels. Historians claim there's no evidence, yet there's an oral tradition that's been passed down through generations. One theory suggests that there's a tunnel connecting the Mosquita to the palace at Medina Azahara, which is over 8 kilometers away. However, there's another, even more widely accepted theory that talks about a tunnel running under the river connecting the Kalahora Tower with the Mosquita. And this might actually be the reason why it's ignored by the mainstream, or even purposely kept quiet. Because if there's a tunnel that long and one that goes under the river, that would have been impossible to build with the technology they say the Arabs had before the 12th century. But there's a lot more to this. There are underground tunnels in the Jewish quarter, and I'll show proof later that there are actual underground sections still there. But another thing that ties into this is something called the Sabbat. The Sabbat was a covered passageway built at ground level that connected the Alcazar, the palace, directly to the Mosquita. It had arches and pillars and was built in a way that let regular street traffic pass underneath. Some say it was for protection so the caliph could move without being seen. Others say it was just a practical way to keep him from disrupting prayer. I can barely find any information on these Sabbats or what they originally looked like, but apparently they were elevated covered bridges. When I look up Sabbats, they seem to all look like tunnels to me. So perhaps they weren't bridges, but instead tunnel systems. What I take from the Mosquita, and what many others are starting to see, is that we're not just dealing with a layered history of disconnected civilizations. Instead, it looks like there was originally an ancient structure here, possibly Tartessian or what's now labeled Roman, which was then buried, and later, a much more recent Eurasian empire came in and built over it and expanded on it. Was that the Moors as we've been told? Or is it more likely that this so-called Moorish architecture actually belongs to a larger imperial style, what some refer to as Tartarian? To be clear, I'm not saying this was some ancient lost civilization like Atlantis. What we're talking about is a relatively recent empire, possibly operating across Eurasia, that's been systematically erased or renamed. And instead of the usual story, Romans, then Visigoths, then Arabs, and then Christians, it's possible we're looking at a single, advanced building culture that used a hybrid style from the start, blending what we now call Islamic, Gothic, and Baroque features, because they were never truly separate to begin with. If you've seen part 1 of Spain Unveiled, then you already know why the Arab conquest narrative doesn't add up. The timeline's all over the place, the cultural connections are vague, and no one can clearly explain where the style actually originated. So maybe what we call Moorish or Baroque isn't Arab or Catholic at all, but the architectural fingerprint of this forgotten Eurasian power. A style that's been misattributed, renamed, and folded into other historical labels to keep the real story hidden. So that's the Mosquita, and there's still so much to explore on it, but let's discuss a few more things in Cordoba. I mentioned the Joderia earlier, and this is where the Alchemy Museum is located, tucked into the Jewish quarter. It was pretty cool. It was kind of new agey, but still kind of fun to walk through. The museum is actually housed in a 13th century building, which is interesting on its own. There were some very beautiful areas of this place, and even in the back there was somewhat of a tunnel. This place was honestly just really peaceful. Super quiet, kind of tucked away. You could easily spend time here just relaxing. The little courtyards were beautiful, lots of greenery, some tiled benches, and these patterned floors that really stood out. There was just such a calm vibe with the water and the vines climbing the walls. The tiles too were really detailed, kind of that classic Andalusian style. You can tell a lot of care went into the layout. Even just walking through the outer areas felt like stepping into another time. Upstairs, they've got some alchemical equipment, old tools, and symbolic displays. And there was even a basement, which feels almost like a crypt. Stone walls, the low ceilings, it's kind of an underground hidden lab, and it even shows that these houses in the Jewish quarter do go beneath street level. Cordoba is known to have a deep connection with alchemy. It was the center of learning during the supposed Islamic Golden Age, and its libraries and scholars were among the most advanced in Europe. The Cordoba Royal Library had hundreds of thousands of volumes. Who knows what originally was kept in these libraries? but it's safe to assume that alchemy and hermetic traditions were preserved. It is strange because this hidden knowledge was being practiced from a convergence of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim intellectuals in medieval Cordoba. One notable figure is Maslama al-Madridi from around 1007 AD, an astronomer, mathematician, and alchemist of Cordoba. He was renowned for his early experiments with chemical substances, like refining mercury oxide, and was later credited with transmitting esoteric texts to the West. Even the famous magical astrological grimoire, pt2, compiled in the 10th century, is often attributed to Maslama of Madrid, which some scholars think was actually a pseudonym referring to al-Madridi, or a Cordovan circle of occultists. Whether or not he wrote it, the pt2 did emanate from Al-Andalus and was later translated into Latin, spreading knowledge of talismanic magic across medieval Europe. It would seem that Cordoba had an underground stream of esoteric learning, parallel to its famed religious and philosophical studies. I think one of the major clues that something is off with the mainstream narrative is this whole Mudahar style that shows up in so many different churches in the area. For example, Santa Marina was supposedly built right after Cordoba was conquered by Castile. Yet not only does the church combine multiple styles, Gothic, Mudahar, and Romanesque, but it was also built on the site of a mosque that used to be a Visigothic church. Sounds familiar? It wasn't just the Christian churches that have this blend of style. Even the synagogue here has this Mudahar style. Another crazy thing is that there are Roman walls here from what they say is 206 BC after the Romans captured the city. These walls completely surround the entire city. So the walls of Cordoba were initially Roman, and then the Moors used them and expanded them. They also have a Roman temple that was discovered in 1950. Then there's the Alcazar of the Christian monarchs, which brings up another clear anomaly. The word Alcazar comes from Arabic, and while it's translated as castle in Spanish, Alcazars are originally Islamic castles. You see them all over Spain, and they feel out of place. If the Christian monarchs were trying to reassert their identity after the Reconquista, why keep building in a clearly Islamic architectural style? The Alcazar in Cordoba follows the same recycled pattern we've seen. First, it was a Visigothic fortress, then a Moorish Alcazar, and finally the current Christian version, supposedly built on top of the older structures. But even this new version retains obvious Islamic design features: courtyards, baths, geometric tile work. And during Moorish rule, the Alcazar wasn't just a military outpost, it was the official residence and seat of power of Al-Andalus. So again, we have this key administrative center supposedly Christianized by conquering kings, who then chose to maintain the same layout, same look, and same location. Then there's the lost city of Medina Azahara, which is very interesting because it shares a lot of similarities with the Mosque Cathedral. But this wasn't just a single building, this was an entire city. Referred to as a palatial city, it is said to have been built in the 10th century, and now it lies in ruins about 5 miles outside of Cordoba. The city supposedly had a mosque, government buildings, residences, gardens, workshops, and baths. Apparently, they even reconstructed a 1st century Roman aqueduct to supply water to the whole place. There's a lot of mystery here because the city was abandoned in the 11th century after a civil war, even though this was supposed to be the Age of Enlightenment. So they just left it barely 100 years after building it. And then on top of that, a lot of the materials were stripped and reused elsewhere. Oh, and they didn't even start excavating until 1911, and it's still being excavated today. But it gets crazier because this city was also called the Radiant City. The main legend says that the name Azahara came from Abd al-Rahman III's favorite wife. The story goes that she was originally from Granada, And even though she had everything, wealth, palaces, gardens, she was still sad. The Caliph asked her what could be done to make her happy, and she said she missed the snow on the mountains back home. So he planted rows and rows of almond trees in the garden, and when they bloomed in the spring, the white blossoms made it look like snow, and Zara cried no more. Now to me, that sounds like a made-up story. I mean, almond blossoms aren't snow, it's not even close. But it gets more interesting because Zara is also the Arabic word for brilliance or radiance. So, Medina Azahara basically means city of brilliance or city of radiance. And here's where the real legend comes in. It's said that in the center of the main hall, there is a fountain filled with mercury, and when the sun hit it, the light would reflect off the surface into thousands of colors and bounce onto the walls and ceiling, creating this overwhelming brilliance, like lightning. When I read that, I was like, hold on, because that's not a story you'll ever really hear about, but it definitely hints at something more. First off, this kind of setup has never been done before, so where did the idea come from? And second, it sounds like an early form of lighting technology. They were using mercury, liquid metal, as a way to illuminate interiors. And when you consider what a lot of researchers have said about mercury and Tartaria, and how it might have been used in buildings to harness energy or electricity, this starts to look more than just a reflection trick. What if the legends are only part of the story? What if they were using mercury for something way more advanced, something that got lost or buried with time? This place was insanely elegant. The walls and roof were lined with colored marble, giving it a translucent look. And the interiors were covered in ebony, ivory, gold, and silver tiles. The whole thing was built to reflect light, and I just find it fascinating that this so-called lost city, literally named the City of Radiance, is tied to legends about using mercury to light up rooms. For now, I'll leave it at that. Maybe one day in the future I'll do a full City Unveiled of Cordoba. But for this video, I wanted to mostly talk about some of the most interesting architecture of the city. Part 3 is very interesting as well, and has to do with Sevilla, so stay tuned, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?